In this video, we will analyze one of the greatest misconceptions of Western historiography, the period that for centuries was called the Dark Ages, and the empire that, even in the heart of that supposedly dark time, kept alive the flames of knowledge, art, and civilization. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is an almost irresistible force in words. When a sufficiently powerful term is applied to an entire era, it not only describes that time, it begins to shape it in the collective memory of humanity. And few expressions in the history of human thought have wielded such enduring and distorted power as the expression Dark Ages. For centuries, this label was repeated in classrooms, encyclopedias, sermons, and political speeches, as if it were an established, incontestable truth carved in stone. The idea was simple and seductive. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, European civilization had plunged into an abyss of ignorance, superstition, and brutality. The light of reason had been extinguished. Progress had ceased. The world had collapsed. But there is a profound problem with this narrative. It is, for the most part, false. Not false in the sense of a deliberate lie, but false in the most dangerous sense possible. A comfortable simplification that served very specific purposes at very specific moments in history. A narrative forged by the intellectual victors of an era who projected their own ambitions and prejudices onto a past they did not know with the depth that truth would require. To understand how this myth was born, and why it survived for so long, one must grasp the context in which it was forged. And this journey begins not in the Middle Ages proper, but centuries later, during a cultural movement that prided itself on having rediscovered classical civilization, the Renaissance. In the 14th century, Italian thinkers and artists like Francesco Petrarch began to look to the past with an almost religious nostalgia. For them, classical antiquity, the Rome and Greece of philosophers, orators, and poets, represented the apex of human achievement, and everything that came after needed a name that expressed just how inferior, barren, and worthless it had been. Petrarch, considered by many to be the first modern humanist, was among the first to use the metaphor of light and darkness to describe this interval. For him, the fall of Rome had extinguished the light of culture, and his own time represented the glorious return of that light. The intermediate period was therefore a void between two moments of civilizational greatness. It was an elegant narrative. It was compelling. It was devastatingly incomplete. This metaphor was rhetorically powerful and easy to repeat. It served perfectly the purpose of glorifying the present at the expense of the past. But it carried a fundamental flaw. It ignored what had actually happened during those centuries it dismissed with such intellectual arrogance. What the Renaissance humanists did not mention is that, while Western Europe underwent its most turbulent transformations, another world continued to exist, to prosper, and to guard with meticulous care the flames of classical knowledge, a world that many knew only superficially, or chose to ignore for reasons that mixed politics, religion, and cultural pride. That world was Constantinople. It was the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire. There, on the shores of the Bosphorus, where Europe meets Asia, a civilization of extraordinary complexity continued to exist for more than 1,000 years after the collapse of the West, a civilization that preserved the texts of Plato, of Aristotle, of Homer, and of Euclid. That built the Hagia Sophia, one of the most ambitious architectural works ever conceived by the human mind. That maintained vital trade routes, sustained a refined diplomacy, and protected, for centuries, the eastern borders of a continent that rarely acknowledged this debt. Constantinople was, in many ways, the beating heart of a world that the narrative of the Dark Ages made a point of ignoring. But history is rarely fair to what does not fit into its most convenient schemes. The Byzantine Empire was Eastern. It was Greek in its language and in its soul. It was Christian in a way that diverged from Roman Catholicism on points that grew increasingly irreconcilable. It was not, therefore, the ancestor that the Italian humanists wanted to celebrate. It was not the Rome they dreamed of resurrecting. And so, through a combination of ignorance, prejudice, and narrative convenience, one of the most enduring empires in history was gradually erased from the popular imagination. While textbooks described the Middle Ages as a period of stagnation and obscurantism, Constantinople raised monuments, translated philosophers, and resisted for centuries the powers that repeatedly tried to put an end to its existence. The injustice of this erasure is not merely academic. It affects the way we understand Western civilization itself, its origins, its intellectual debts, and the tortuous paths by which human knowledge survived its most profound crises. In the following steps, we will delve into the layers of this misconception. We will examine what the Byzantine Empire was and accomplished, how the myth of the darkness was constructed, who benefited from this construction, and what happens when modern historiography finally begins to deconstruct it. Because there is something deeply revealing in the fact that the history of a brilliant empire was narrated for centuries as if it were a story of darkness. That revelation, when it arrives with all its force, transforms not only our view of the past, but also the way we see and question the present. To understand why Constantinople became what it became, we must go back in time to a moment of decision that would change the course of ancient history. The moment when a Roman emperor, contemplating the vastness of a territory that had become impossible to govern from a single city, chose a point on the map and declared, "Here will be the center of the world." That emperor was Constantine I, whom history would come to know as Constantine the Great, and the year was 330 AD. Constantine's decision was not impulsive. It was the result of decades of crises, civil wars, and restructurings that had profoundly transformed the Roman Empire. Rome had ceased to be the real capital of the empire long before that. Emperors governed where wars took them, where borders needed defense, where power required a physical presence. Constantine executed it with unprecedented audacity. The chosen location was Byzantium, an ancient Greek colony situated on a narrow peninsula where the Bosphorus meets the Sea of Marmara, a place of striking geographical beauty and inestimable strategic value. By land, it was protected by a narrow, easily defensible isthmus. By sea, it had simultaneous access to the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, the two great axes of trade in the ancient world. It was the exact point where Europe and Asia conversed. Constantine ordered the construction of a city, worthy of being called a new Rome. Construction sites of colossal scale transformed that Greek colony into a monumental metropolis. Palaces, hippodromes, forums, aqueducts, and churches were erected. Monuments were brought from all parts of the empire, as if all the grandeur of the ancient world was being carefully transplanted to that promontory between two seas. It was a calculated reinvention, but also a declaration. The empire was not dying. It was reinventing itself. On May 11, 330, Constantine officially inaugurated the city. He named it New Rome, but time and the devotion of its inhabitants consecrated another name: Constantinople, the city of Constantine. What is essential to understand is that this new capital did not emerge as a rupture with Rome. It emerged as its continuation. The citizens of Constantinople considered themselves Romans. They spoke Latin in administration and the army, even though Greek was the living language of the streets and markets. They preserved the legal institutions, titles, and rituals of the old empire. The emperor in Constantinople was, in the eyes of the world and in his own, the legitimate successor of Augustus and Julius Caesar. This detail is crucial for understanding the injustice that would come later. When the Western Roman Empire lost its political form in 476, the East did not proclaim itself something new. It continued to call itself Roman. It continued to govern itself as Roman. And it did so for more than 1,000 years, a continuity without parallel in the political history of the ancient world. Historians of the 19th century were the first to call this set of centuries the Byzantine Empire, deriving the name from the ancient Greek toponym. It was useful nomenclature academically, but it carried an unforeseen consequence. It made it easier to separate this empire from the Roman legacy, treating it as a distinct, peripheral, almost exotic entity, as if it were another world, and not the living continuation of the same. The city itself was a daily demonstration of what that people was capable of achieving. At its height, Constantinople had between 300,000 and 500,000 inhabitants, making it the largest city in the Mediterranean and Europe for several centuries. For comparison, Rome had shrunk by around the 6th century to perhaps 40,000 people. London, in that same period, was little more than a collection of modest settlements by the riverside. Constantinople had a hippodrome for 80,000 spectators, the Via Maese flanked by porticos and statues, libraries, hospitals, orphanages, and a food distribution system for the most vulnerable population. It had an imperial university dating back to the 4th century, where law, philosophy, rhetoric, and medicine were taught uninterrupted, generation after generation. And it had the walls. Built in the 5th century under Emperor Theodosius II, the walls of Constantinople formed a multi-layered defensive system that protected the city from the land side. They were so advanced that the city would withstand more than 1,000 years of dozens of sieges and attempts at conquest, revealing a level of technical sophistication that later historiography insisted on erasing from the center of the narrative. The Imperial Navy developed the so-called Greek fire, an incendiary substance of secret composition capable of acting even on water, giving the imperial fleets an advantage without equal at the time. The formula remains an undeciphered secret of history, but its existence demonstrated something unequivocal, that empire not only preserved the knowledge of the past, but expanded it and applied it in new ways. The Byzantine mosaics, composed of thousands of tesserae of colored glass and gold leaf, developed a visual language of singular expressive power. The illuminated manuscripts, the icons painted with techniques refined over generations, the monumental religious architecture, all of this was produced in Constantinople with a regularity and quality that directly contradict the image of a dark age. And it is here that the narrative of the Dark Ages begins to reveal its deepest contradictions, because if there was darkness somewhere, it certainly was not on the Bosphorus. It was, perhaps, in the eyes of those who looked at that world without truly wanting to see it. What this empire preserved, produced and transmitted to the rest of humanity will be the subject of the next chapter of this investigation. And it is a story that historiography took centuries to tell with the seriousness and attention it always deserved. If there is a name that synthesizes both the grandeur and the contradictions of the Byzantine Empire, that name is Justinian. Emperor of the East from 527 to 565 AD, Justinian the Phowai ruled during a period when the empire's ambition perhaps reached its highest point, and when the marks left by his reign would extend for centuries far beyond its own geographical borders. He was the son of peasants from Macedonia. He was not born in a palace nor raised among the nobility. He was adopted by his own uncle, who had ascended to the throne by military merit, and was educated with the care reserved for heirs to future state responsibilities. When he assumed power, he brought with him an unusual combination: the ambition to restore the glory of the ancient unified Roman Empire and the intelligence to surround himself with people capable of turning that vision into something real and lasting. One of those people was Theodora. The story of Theodora is, in itself, a separate documentary. Daughter of a bear tamer from the Hippodrome, she grew up on the humblest margins of Constantinopolitan society and worked as an actress in a world that held little respect for that profession. And yet she rose to Justinian's side in a way that defied all the conventions of her time. More than a decorative figure beside a powerful emperor, Theodora was a de facto ruler. She participated in the most complex political decisions. She exercised real influence over legislation, especially in matters that affected the condition of women and the most vulnerable groups in society. The episode that history would come to call the Nika Revolt, which occurred in 532, is the most cited example of this determination, when a significant part of Constantinople rose up against the government, and much of the imperial council considered abandoning the city as the only possible way out. It was Theodora who stood up and declared, according to the account of the historian Procopius, that she would rather not survive the end of her reign. The firmness of that statement changed the course of events. The revolt was contained. Justinian remained on the throne. But Justinian's legacy is not measured only in moments of crisis. It is measured above all in what he built and organized for the generations that followed. The first and perhaps most enduring of these legacies is the Corpus Juris Civilis, the great codification of Roman law ordered by Justinian and executed by a team of jurists under the direction of the magistrate Tribonian. Compiled between 529 and 534, this body of legal texts gathered centuries of laws, decrees, and interpretations of Roman law into a cohesive, organized, and accessible system. It was one of the most ambitious intellectual works that the ancient world had produced. The rigorous systematization of how an entire civilization had learned over centuries to regulate human coexistence through written law. The corpus did not die with the empire. It survived. It was rediscovered in medieval European universities, especially in Bologna, around the 11th century, and became the foundation upon which most legal systems of continental Europe were built. French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, German civil law all carry, to varying degrees, the mark of the work carried out by Justinian's jurists in Constantinople in the 6th century. When defenders of the Dark Ages claim that nothing of relevance was produced in that period, they ignore that the legal foundation upon which much of the Western world still operates today was written precisely then. The second great legacy of the reign is architectural, and its name is Hagia Sophia. Built between 532 and 537, in only 5 years, Hagia Sophia represented a deliberate challenge to the limits of what human engineering was capable of achieving. Its architects, Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles, developed a structural solution of extraordinary sophistication, a massive central dome supported by semi-domes and arches that distributed the weight in such a way that the interior seemed to float upon light. Contemporaries described the effect as supernatural. It is said that upon entering the newly completed basilica, Justinian exclaimed that he had surpassed King Solomon. Whether truth or rhetorical exaggeration, the magnitude of the feat was undeniable. For nearly 1,000 years, Hagia Sophia was the largest enclosed interior space in the world, not as an isolated architectural curiosity, but as a living, functional space at the heart of one of the greatest cities on earth. No comparable structure would arise in the Western world for centuries. It was in stone, marble, and gold, the materialization of what that empire was capable of dreaming and executing. Justinian's military campaign to reunify the ancient Roman Empire was the third great project of his reign. His generals, especially Belisarius and Narses, recovered North Africa, Italy, and part of the Iberian Peninsula. For a brief period, the Mediterranean once again became to a large extent a Roman sea. The project would not sustain itself long after Justinian's death, but the audacity of the vision was revealing. This was an empire that did not see itself as a nostalgic fragment of a closed past, but as the legitimate heir of a historical mission still underway. When we look at the 6th century with the attention it deserves, what we find is not darkness. It is a civilization that codified law, erected domes that defied gravity, and reconquered continents. A civilization that, even in its moments of greatest internal tension, never stopped building, writing, and debating the meaning of what it was doing. And yet for centuries it was narrated as an interval without light. The next chapter of this investigation will examine another dimension of this history: the role of the great theological disputes in the construction of Byzantine identity, and the slow, irreversible drift between the Christian East and the West that would forever shape the destiny of both. There is an aspect of the Byzantine Empire that Western textbooks rarely examine with the depth it deserves: the relationship between imperial power and the Christian faith. To understand why the West and the East separated so radically, and why this separation directly contributed to the erasure of the Byzantine legacy, it is necessary to enter into the great theological disputes that marked the early centuries of the empire. In the medieval world, religion was not a dimension separate from political life. In many senses, it was the very language of power. And in the Byzantine Empire, this fusion of faith and authority reached a unique form, which historians sometimes call Caesaropapism, the notion that the emperor was at once the temporal ruler and the supreme protector of the Christian faith. Not a priest, but the guardian of orthodoxy, the one responsible for maintaining the religious unity of the empire as an essential condition of its political cohesion. This conception generated a permanent tension. Whenever theological controversies arose, and they arose with notable frequency, the emperor was called upon to arbitrate questions that the theologians themselves could not resolve. Questions about the nature of Christ, about the legitimacy of certain liturgical practices, about the role of religious images in worship. Questions that for the inhabitants of the empire were not philosophical abstractions, but matters of deep existential urgency. Iconoclasm, which erupted in the 8th century, is perhaps the most dramatic example of how these disputes could divide the very heart of the empire. The debate revolved around a seemingly simple question: was it legitimate to venerate sacred images, the so-called icons, as a means of access to the divine? Or did this practice constitute idolatry, a corruption of the faith that needed to be urgently eliminated? Emperor Leo III, in 726, ordered the removal of icons from the churches of the empire. The decision provoked a reaction of unexpected proportions. Monks, artists, and entire populations resisted. The Pope in Rome condemned the measure. The Patriarch of Constantinople was deposed. For over a century, the empire oscillated between prohibition and restoration of images, while theologians from both sides accumulated arguments with a philosophical sophistication that few periods of human thought can match. What iconoclasm revealed, above any doctrinal resolution, was the depth of the division forming between the Christian East and West. Rome had firmly positioned itself in defense of icons. Constantinople had been the center of the controversy. The political consequences of this divergence would accumulate for decades, weaving the fabric of a rupture that was yet to come. That rupture would arrive in 1054, at a moment that history has conventionally called the Great Schism. The separation was not the result of a single conflict or sudden decision. It was the culmination of centuries of progressive estrangement between two ways of being Christian that had grown in increasingly distinct cultural, linguistic, and political contexts. The West spoke Latin and gravitated around Rome. The East spoke Greek and had in Constantinople its spiritual and political center. The liturgical differences were numerous, the doctrinal disagreements real, and the political ambitions of both sides made every theological dispute also a dispute over power and influence. The question that catalyzed the final collapse was the so-called filioque, a Latin word meaning "and from the Son." The debate concerned the nature of the Trinity. Did the Holy Spirit proceed only from the Father, as the Eastern tradition affirmed, or from the Father and the Son, as the West had inserted into the Nicene Creed without consulting the East? The question may seem esoteric from a distance of 10 centuries. At the time, it was lived with the intensity of an abyss. In July 1054, Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, sent by the Pope to Constantinople, placed upon the altar of Hagia Sophia a document of excommunication directed at Patriarch Michael Cerularius. The latter excommunicated the cardinal. Two representatives of the same Christian faith exchanged formal condemnations inside the greatest temple of the known world. The schism was consummated. The consequences of this rupture for the perception of Byzantium in the West were profound and enduring. After 1054, the Byzantine Empire came to be seen as something formally separate, potentially heretical. The community of identity that had once united the two halves of the former Roman Empire was finally shattered. And the more the West drifted spiritually away from Constantinople, the easier it became to ignore or downplay what that civilization had produced over the centuries. The religious estrangement acted as an amplifier of historical erasure. It was not the sole cause, but it was one of the most persistent and effective. When a civilization is perceived as alien, not only geographically but also spiritually, the instinct to narrate one's own history without it grows far stronger. There was also a practical dimension to this estrangement that is rarely mentioned. The two Christian traditions developed distinct ways of preserving knowledge. In the West, Latin was the universal language of learning, concentrated mainly in monasteries. In the East, Greek was the vehicle of an intellectual tradition much closer to the philosophical sources of classical antiquity. When the schism deepened the distance between them, the flow of texts and ideas between the two diminished markedly. And for a long time, the West simply ceased to know what the East knew. The Christian East and West would follow increasingly divergent paths after 1054. And Byzantium, already deprived of many natural allies in the Christian world, would face in the centuries to come threats of an intensity few empires in history have had to endure. It is this period that the next chapter will address. In the spring of 1204, an episode unfolded in Constantinople that to this day defies historical and moral understanding. A city that had resisted for over 800 years, every army that had tried to take it was finally overcome. Not by external enemies, not by invaders of another faith, but by Christian crusaders from the West who had set out in the name of God to liberate the Holy Land and ended up sacking the greatest Christian city in the known world. To understand how this was possible, one must step back a few decades and examine the state in which the Byzantine Empire found itself from the second half of the 11th century onward. In 1071, the imperial army suffered a defeat of historic proportions at the Battle of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia. The Seljuk forces, led by Sultan Alp Arslan, confronted the army of Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes in a clash that would become a watershed moment. Romanos IV was captured. For the first time in centuries, Anatolia began to be lost to the Turks in a gradual but structurally irreversible manner. And Anatolia was not merely territory. It was the empire's main source of army recruitment, the breadbasket that fed its cities, and the economic base that sustained the central administration. Losing it was like tearing out the productive heart of the empire. The Byzantium that emerged from the decades following Manzikert was structurally smaller, economically more vulnerable, and politically unstable. It still functioned, it still produced, it still resisted, but the foundations that had upheld its greatness for centuries had been shaken in a way no subsequent emperor could fully repair. It was in this context of progressive weakening that the Crusades arrived. The Emperor Alexios Thermokomnenos sent an appeal to Pope Urban II in 1095, requesting military aid against the Turks. What arrived in response was not exactly what had been requested. Instead of disciplined forces that could be integrated into the imperial army, waves of Western warriors came who did not recognize the authority of Constantinople, distrusted the orthodox faith of the Byzantines, and carried their own political and territorial objectives. The First Crusade achieved military results in the Middle East, but the cost to Byzantium in terms of sovereignty and territorial control was high. Relations between the Byzantine Empire and the Crusaders were, from the very beginning, marked by a structural tension that time would only deepen. The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as potentially useful allies, but fundamentally unpredictable. The Crusaders, for their part, tended to view the Byzantines with a mixture of admiration for Constantinople's wealth and distrust due to the religious difference that the schism of 1054 had consolidated. They were, in theory, members of the same Christian faith. In practice, they increasingly treated each other as strangers who shared only the name. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, was the point at which this tension transformed into something unimaginable. The original objective was to attack Egypt, cutting support to Muslim forces in the eastern Mediterranean. But a series of diversions, unpayable debts contracted with Venetian merchants, and complex political maneuvers redirected the Crusader army to Constantinople. In April 1204, after a relatively brief siege, the walls that had withstood centuries were breached. What followed were days of looting that even medieval chroniclers recorded with shock and shame. Sacred relics, priceless Greek and Roman sculptures, unique manuscripts, icons, gold, silver, precious fabrics, works that had taken generations to produce, vanished in a matter of days. Part of the imperial library, which held texts from classical antiquity that existed nowhere else in the world, was destroyed or dispersed beyond recovery. Pope Innocent III, who had launched the crusade, expressed horror upon learning what had been done. But the deed was done. The city was occupied by an entity that history calls the Latin Empire of Constantinople, an artificial construct that would last 60 years without ever acquiring the depth or legitimacy of the empire it had replaced. The Byzantine imperial court took refuge in Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia, where it maintained with remarkable tenacity the cultural and administrative continuity of the empire in exile. In 1261, Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos retook Constantinople without significant resistance. The Byzantine Empire had risen again, but the Byzantium that returned was not the same as before. Its resources were a fraction of what they had been, its territory was drastically smaller, the confidence that had sustained centuries of administrative continuity was marked by the experience of having been destroyed from within. And the trauma of 1204, the awareness that the Christian West itself had plundered what was most magnificent in the Eastern Christian civilization, would never be fully overcome. The sack of 1204 is one of the most eloquent episodes regarding the practical consequences of the Great Schism. It demonstrates, with a clarity that no theological argument could match, to what extent the West had ceased to see Byzantium as a brother and had come to see it as another, a rich territory to be exploited when the opportunity arose. The paradox that closes this chapter is bitter. Many of the Greek manuscripts scattered or looted in 1204 would, decades and centuries later, end up contributing to what the West would call the Renaissance. The very civilization that was plundered would be posthumously celebrated as a source of inspiration. And the Renaissance, in turn, would become one of the instruments of the historical erasure of its origin. The next chapter will examine the final act of this story and what it reveals about how the world remembers and chooses not to remember what it lost. The Byzantine Empire that rose again in 1261, after 6 decades of exile in Nicaea, was a shadow of its former self. Territorially reduced to Constantinople and a few enclaves on the European and Asian coasts, economically exhausted and politically weakened by internal divisions, the Byzantium of the Palaiologos ruled with an increasingly vivid awareness that time was working against it. The threat that would consolidate as definitive was not new. The Ottoman Turks had emerged in northwestern Anatolia in the late 13th century, initially as a small principality among many. But with remarkable military discipline, an ability to absorb the peoples they conquered, and a consistent strategic vision, the Ottoman Empire grew with a regularity that few could ignore. By the 14th century, they had already crossed into Europe. By the early 15th century, they were periodically besieging Constantinople. The city had transformed into a Christian enclave within a world increasingly dominated by Ottoman power. The emperors of the last phase of the empire tirelessly sought support from the West. They traveled personally to Rome, to France, to England, and to the Holy Roman Empire. They offered theological concessions that had been unthinkable centuries before. The Council of Florence, held between 1438 and 1439, was the closest moment of this rapprochement. Representatives of the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church reached a formal declaration of reunification, which Emperor John VIII Palaiologos hoped would translate into concrete military support from the West. The support never arrived on the necessary scale. The Declaration of Florence was rejected by much of the clergy and the Orthodox population, who preferred to live under Ottoman sovereignty than to submit to Rome. There is an account, frequently cited by historians, of a high-ranking official of the empire who allegedly said he would rather see the city ruled by the Turkish turban than by the papal mitre. The phrase sums up, with brutal economy, what decades of religious estrangement and the trauma of 1204 had done to the trust between the two sides of the Christian world. Mehmed II ascended the Ottoman throne in 1451 at the age of 21. He was a young man who had grown up with the ambition of conquering Constantinople. He spoke several languages, had studied history, admired the Roman emperors, and fully understood the symbolic value of the city he wished to take. Conquering Constantinople would not be merely a military victory, it would be the definitive declaration that the Ottoman Empire was the new dominant power of the Mediterranean world. Mehmed acted with meticulous preparation. He ordered the construction of the fortress of Rumeli Hisar on the European shore of the Bosphorus, blocking naval access to the city from the north. He assembled an army estimated at 60,000 to 80,000 men, and he mobilized heavy artillery of a kind that the walls of Constantinople, so effective against previous attacks, had never faced on such a scale. The Hungarian inventor Urban had offered his services to Emperor Constantine V, who lacked the resources to hire him. Mehmed hired him. The cannons that Urban built were of a scale that would forever change the nature of siege warfare. The siege began in April 1453. The defenders of Constantinople numbered about 7,000 men, including a contingent of Genoese mercenaries, against an army many times larger and an artillery that dismantled the walls with unprecedented effectiveness. They held out for 53 days. Inside the city, as the defenses gave way point by point, Emperor Constantine V Palaiologos walked the walls, encouraged his soldiers, and refused the surrender offers that Mehmed had conveyed to him. He was aware that the end was likely. He chose to remain. In the early hours of May 29, 1453, the defenses were breached. Constantine V did not survive the fall of the city. The Eastern Roman Empire, which had existed in some form for more than 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, was coming to an end. The news spread across Europe with a speed surprising for the time. In Venice, the bells tolled. In Rome, Pope Nicholas V was dismayed. The humanist Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who would soon become Pope Pius II, wrote that the second death of Homer and the second death of Plato had occurred, referring to the manuscripts that would be lost. The fall of Constantinople was perceived, even by those who had done nothing to prevent it, as a catastrophe of civilizational proportions. What it represented for the history of knowledge was, in fact, immense. But many manuscripts were not lost. Decades before the fall, during the empire's years of agony, Byzantine scholars had already begun to leave for the West, taking with them what they could carry, box after box of Greek texts. Gemistus Pletho, Cardinal Bessarion, and other court intellectuals arrived in Italy with this collection in hand, and it was precisely this flow of knowledge, of Platonic and Aristotelian texts in their original Greek, that nourished the Florentine academies and propelled what the West would call the Renaissance. The final act of the Byzantine Empire thus contains one of the deepest ironies in intellectual history. The collapse of one civilization became the fuel for the flourishing of another, and the flourishing that followed built its identity upon the discovery of a classical past that in truth had never been lost. It had been preserved for centuries precisely by the civilization that the Renaissance would choose to call dark. This irony opens the question that the following chapter will attempt to answer. When modern historiography, armed with better tools and a critical distance that earlier centuries lacked, began to question the myth of the Dark Ages, what did it find? And what does it mean for us to recognize how much this narrative has distorted our understanding of the past? For nearly 2 centuries after the Renaissance, the myth of the Dark Ages seemed unshakable. Repeated in encyclopedias and taught in universities, it had acquired a resilience of its own, independent of the evidence that medieval documents already provided to contradict it. The revision of the concept began gradually in the 18th and 19th centuries and deepened decisively throughout the 20th century. Historians such as Peter Brown demonstrated that the period between the 3rd and 8th centuries had been not a decline but a profound transformation, marked by cultural, philosophical, and spiritual creativity of great sophistication. Scholars like Judith Herron and John Julius Norwich brought Byzantium back to the center of historical debate, not as a peripheral curiosity, but as one of the most complex and enduring empires that human history has known. What this reassessment revealed was something more unsettling than the sheer grandeur of the Byzantine Empire. It revealed that the very category of the Dark Ages had, from the start, been less a historical description than an ideological instrument. A tool crafted by Renaissance humanists to glorify their own era, perpetuated by Enlightenment thinkers to criticize the medieval church, and fueled by later European thought to sustain narratives of civilizational superiority. Each age found in this concept exactly what it needed, and Byzantium, inconveniently too Eastern and too sophisticated to fit the scheme, was repeatedly left out. Byzantium lasted over 1,000 years. It produced law that underpins Western legal systems, architecture that still challenges modern engineering, philosophy that nourished the Renaissance that ignored it, and art that remains among the most expressive in human history. It preserved the knowledge of classical antiquity when that knowledge faced a real risk of disappearing, and it paid the price for all of this with centuries of historical invisibility. The history covered in this documentary is not merely that of an empire. It is the story of how words shape what we are able to see, how narratives serve interests that have little to do with truth, and how the honesty of questioning what we have been taught can give back to us parts of the world we thought were lost. The past is not fixed. It changes as we are willing to look at it more carefully. If this journey has brought something new to the way you see history, like this video, write in the comments what surprised you most throughout this narrative, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. There are many other brilliant empires, erased figures and misunderstood periods, waiting to have their stories told with the honesty they deserve. History, when narrated with rigor and without fear of questioning what seems obvious, never disappoints.